Morning, West and the world. Welcome to this review video on Tuesday, December the 9th. Our concluding review video for this semester, though we still have one last class period on Thursday, with the final exam following so quickly on the heels of that class on Friday. I won't likely be making another video. And besides, with today's lecture on sort of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism, most of the major themes, especially related to those short answer questions for the final exam, we've now sort of drawn to their conclusion. On Thursday, we will talk a little bit about how we might make some interpretation of what's happened in the world since the end of communist rule. But today, our focus was on sort of two things. One was on sort of the cultural shifts that take place, or developments that take place in, especially the Western world, in the context of the Cold War. Movements that your book calls or refers to under the umbrella of movements of liberation. We concentrated on two in particular. The upswing in university enrollments and the emergence of a youth culture out of that, and closely connected to it, the sort of advent of a revived feminist or women's rights movement in the 60s and 70s, and this sort of demand for something that more truly resembles true equality. Both of these movements we saw have significant transformative effects, and both of them represent in their own ways the kind of unsettling context of the Cold War. People's sort of dissatisfaction with the status quo and their desire to bring about some kind of change. After we talked about those movements and the sort of the sexual revolution that stems from both, the advent of the pill, we moved from there into talking about the reasons why communism collapses in the late 1980s at the conclusion of the Cold War. We said that some of this could have been forecasted in some ways from much earlier times, looking at the example of the Prague Spring in 1968, which foreshadows in many ways this unrest, this rising up against the repressive nature of communist totalitarianism. It also we also looked at, I think, five, well, I'll count them off here, we'll see if it's 4 or 5, very specific reasons why the Soviet Union collapses after the pressures of the late 70s and the early 80s have built up. Those pressures, we said, were economic depression, or an economic crisis. Secondly, a very, very taxing war in Afghanistan. Number 3, the labor unrest and other kinds of political discontent that reemerges in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. And then finally, the instability at the top as Brezhnev's death is followed quickly by this succession of leaders between 1982 and 1985. What emerges out of that, of course, is the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, a very different kind of leader, someone with a vision of reforming communism, largely out of necessity. Those policies of glasnost, the intellectual openness, and perestroika, an economic restructuring, the reduction in Soviet military commitments around the world. As we said in class, this is all meant to reform communism, to ensure the long-term stability of the Soviet Union, not to unravel it, but that's exactly what happens. And so we saw that beginning in Eastern Europe, and in the crucial year of 1989, popular demonstrations sweep away with varying degrees of violence. The communist governments of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and then East Germany and Romania as well. The effect of this is also dramatic that by 1991, when Gorbachev finally steps down as president of the Soviet Union, he is essentially stepping down as president of a state that no longer exists, that there is no Soviet Union to speak of, as its members, Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, have all gone their separate ways and established themselves as independent states. And so the Cold War is over by the early 1990s, and it appears in some ways that Western liberal democratic capitalism has won. What we'll do on Thursday is talk a little bit about sort of what happens next and whether or not the byproduct of this is quite as clear as it appeared to be in the early 1990s. See you on Thursday morning, everybody.